It wasn't madness that haunted the halls. It was medicine itself. Long before the sterile white walls of modern hospitals, there stood a place that America called its first beacon of mental healing. Built in 1808, it was meant to be a sanctuary for the broken, a safe harbor for those who had lost themselves to the shadows of their own minds. But what emerged instead was something darker. A fortress of despair where sanity was not restored, but stripped away piece by piece. The asylum stood on the outskirts of a small New England town surrounded by mist and the whisper of trees. Locals called it the House of the Silent, because no one who entered ever truly came back. Over time, it grew into a labyrinth of wards, iron doors, and echoing corridors. Its architects dreamed of reforming the treatment of the mentally ill, yet what unfolded behind those locked gates became one of the most haunting chapters in American history. The early 19th century was an era when madness was not understood. It was feared. A woman could be labeled insane for reading too much, for disagreeing with her husband, or for mourning a lost child for too long. A man might be confined for debt, epilepsy, or even melancholy. There were no diagnoses, no therapy, no empathy. Once inside, you were no longer a person. You were a patient, a specimen, a lost cause. Inside the asylum, the air smelled of damp stone and lie. The screams of patients were often mistaken for the wind. Cells barely larger than coffins held men and women together, chained by their wrists to cold walls. Doctors roamed the corridors with notebooks and steel instruments, convinced that pain was a path to cure. They believed that the mind could be shocked back to health through ice baths, bleeding, or the newly invented electrotherapy. By candlelight, the superintendent recorded his findings. His handwriting began neatly, clinical, detached. But as years passed, the words twisted into madness. He wrote of patients who spoke in unison, of shadows that watched him during inspections, of a woman in cell 12 who never slept but hummed hymns that no one recognized. The further his entries went, the less they read like science and more like confession. When the asylum expanded in 1836, a new underground wing was built for non-compliant patients, those who resisted treatment or whose screams disrupted others. No official blueprints of this wing survive, but when researchers rediscovered the site centuries later, they found the remains of shackles and leather restraints embedded in the stone. It became clear that the goal had never been healing. It had been containment. Over time, death became routine. Patients vanished overnight, recorded only as transferred. The graveyard behind the asylum swelled with unmarked mounds, each one filled by a nameless body. Their files were sealed, their identities erased. When relatives came to ask about their loved ones, the staff told them they had moved on. No one asked where. By the turn of the 20th century, the asylum was a relic, a decaying reminder of medical arrogance and human cruelty. The world around it began to change, but the asylum did not. When fire swept through the records room in 1912, hundreds of files burned to ash, but some survived, hidden deep in the basement. When historians uncovered them years later, they revealed stories too disturbing for fiction, of experiments gone wrong, of forgotten patients buried alive in bureaucracy. Even now, the grounds are said to whisper. Paranormal investigators who visit claim to hear footsteps pacing above them, even when the upper floors are empty. Cold air seeps from sealed rooms, and faint cries echo from the walls. Locals say the souls of those who died there never left, trapped between the world of the living and the hell that was once called treatment. The rediscovery of these patient files has opened more than just history. It has unearthed a collective guilt. Every faded note, every trembling signature, every forgotten name tells a story of how far humans will go to control what they don't understand. The asylum may be gone, but its ghosts remain, etched in paper, bone, and memory. This is not just the story of a building. It is the story of a nation learning the cost of its own cruelty, a place where medicine met madness, and compassion turned into horror. The truth was buried for centuries. Now it demands to be unearthed. The year was 1808, a time when America was still defining itself, when science and superstition walked hand in hand, and when the human mind remained one of the greatest mysteries. In a quiet corner of New England, a group of reformers, physicians, and ministers gathered with a vision. They wanted to create something new, a place of healing for those who had been cast aside as lunatics. Their dream was noble, even revolutionary for its time, to treat madness as illness, not evil. But what began as a sanctuary soon decayed into a nightmare. The founders called it the State Hospital for the Mentally Disturbed, though the locals simply called it the Asylum. Its construction took nearly 3 years. A sprawling brick structure surrounded by acres of open fields. The architecture was meant to soothe. Wide windows to let in light, gardens to calm the mind, and long corridors that symbolized the patient's journey back to reason. Every detail was chosen to reflect hope. They believed that the right environment could mend broken minds, a philosophy inspired by the new European ideas of moral treatment. Ebrowie. In its early years, optimism ran high. Dr. Elijah Winthrop, the asylum's first superintendent, was a man of intellect and compassion, at least on paper. He believed that isolation from society could retrain the disordered mind. "We will not chain men like beasts," he wrote in his founding journal, "but lead them back to the light through discipline and care." Patients were given simple tasks, tending gardens, mending clothes, or painting. Music was introduced as therapy. For a while, it seemed to work. Local newspapers called it a miracle of modern science. But beneath the surface, the cracks were already forming. The asylum had been built not just to heal, but to contain. Counties across the region quickly realized they could send their undesirables there. The poor, the homeless, unmarried mothers, even widows who spoke too freely. The institution, once designed for a few dozen, became overcrowded with hundreds. Beds lined the hallways, food grew scarce, and with overcrowding came neglect and abuse. Dr. Winthrop's methods began to change. Overwhelmed and underfunded, he replaced compassion with control. "They must obey before they can recover," he wrote in one of his letters. New rules were introduced: silence during meals, isolation for disobedience, physical restraints for violent outbursts. Soon, the so-called moral treatment gave way to punishment disguised as therapy. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible to the public. Families continued to send their loved ones in hope, unaware that the asylum's walls had become a place of torment. Patients were strapped to chairs for hours, sometimes days, in the belief that stillness would quiet the mind. Others were forced into icy baths until they stopped shaking, a method meant to shock reason back into place. Women who cried too loudly were gagged with rags. Men who refused to work were locked in dark cells beneath the East Wing. The change in atmosphere was felt most by the attendants, poorly trained men and women hired to manage the growing number of patients. Some entered with sympathy, but most grew hardened. Violence became routine. "If they scream, beat them quiet," one supervisor told a new recruit, according to later testimony. By 1815, there were whispers of deaths inside. Patients who fell from windows, others who disappeared. But the records always told the same story: natural causes. In the superintendent's office, Dr. Winthrop's journal began to take a darker turn. His once hopeful entries turned fragmented and obsessive. He wrote of sleepless nights, of hearing footsteps in the empty halls, of seeing faces pressed against the window glass after midnight. "They do not sleep," he wrote of his patients, "and now neither do I." His colleagues dismissed it as exhaustion, but the truth was spreading like rot. The asylum had begun to devour its own creator. One of the earliest recorded patients, a young woman named Mary Ellis, became the symbol of what the asylum truly was. She had been sent there for melancholia, what we would now call depression, after the death of her child. Within a year, she was described in staff notes as hysterical, violent, and incurable. She died in 1813, just 5 years after the asylum's founding. Her death certificate listed self-inflicted wounds. But when later researchers reviewed her file, they found mentions of bruises around the neck and fractures inconsistent with suicide. Mary's death was the first of many covered up beneath the asylum's polished reputation. As time passed, the surrounding town began to change its tone. At first, they had admired the asylum as a beacon of progress, but soon stories began to leak. Farmers living nearby spoke of screams that carried across the fields at night. Children dared each other to approach the gates, claiming they saw faces in the upper windows. Ministers warned their congregations to pray for the poor souls trapped in darkness. By the 1820s, the asylum was no longer a marvel of modern medicine. It was a place to fear. Yet still, it expanded. Funding came from the state, eager to show its commitment to public welfare. A new wing was added in 1824, one that went underground. Officially, it was called the Correctional Annex, meant for violent or unmanageable patients. Unofficially, it became a dungeon. No light entered its cells. No one but attendants and the superintendent were allowed below. When a later investigation uncovered the blueprints, the notes in the margins read chillingly, "Noise-proofed walls for safety. Abr by the time Dr." Winthrop died in 1829. The asylum was unrecognizable. What had begun as a monument to healing had become an experiment in control. His replacement, Dr. Samuel Gray, inherited not a hospital, but a house of horrors, and though he promised reform, the cycle of cruelty continued. The birth of America's first asylum was supposed to mark the beginning of compassion in mental health care. Instead, it revealed a truth the nation wasn't ready to face, that fear of the unknown, of madness, of difference, of pain, can turn even the most well-meaning places into prisons. The walls were built to contain the insane, but what they really contained was the darkness of those who thought they could play God. 2 centuries later, when the surviving patient files were rediscovered, the paper was brittle and yellowed, yet the ink still burned with pain. Each file was a voice that had been silenced, now whispering again through time. The asylum had been born in hope, but it lived in horror. Its story is not just about madness. It's about what happens when humanity forgets mercy in its pursuit of control. When the archives of America's first asylum were reopened in 1956, what researchers found inside the basement vault sent chills through every historian and psychologist who laid eyes on it. There, in a series of rotted wooden cabinets, lay over 2,000 patient files preserved only by accident, or perhaps fate. The folders were bound with brittle leather, marked with ink faded to brown, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air. Dust covered everything, but beneath it lay the lives of people erased from history, the forgotten souls of the asylum's darkest century. Each file told a story, and together they painted a horrifying portrait of what life had really been like inside those walls. The asylum's official records spoke of treatments, progress, and recovery, but these files, handwritten notes, scraps of letters, death certificates, told another story entirely, one of neglect, cruelty, and silence. The earliest entries were neat and hopeful, full of clinical observations. Patient exhibits melancholy, patient responds to outdoor labor. Yet as the decades passed, the writing grew frantic and cruel. Patient uncooperative, applied restraints, refused to eat, force-fed, hysterical, recommended seclusion indefinitely. One file, belonging to patient 217th, was particularly haunting. Her name was Abigail Ward, admitted in 1822 for what was then called religious mania. She was just 16. Her father, a local minister, believed she had been possessed after she claimed to see angels of fire above their home. In truth, Abigail had likely suffered from severe epilepsy or schizophrenia, conditions barely understood at the time. Her treatment began with isolation and prayer, then ice baths, then moral correction. The notes that followed read like a descent into madness not caused by illness, but by the asylum itself. Patient refuses to speak, one entry said. Patient laughs at shadows, read another. Patient no longer responds to light or name. Her final note, dated March 1827, was written in a trembling hand. Abracay patient found in cell. Still breathing, eyes open, no sound. After that, her file ended. No discharge, no burial record, no grave. Abigail Ward simply vanished. And she was not alone. File after file repeated the same quiet tragedy. Men and women from all walks of life, farmers, teachers, veterans, even children, were swallowed by the asylum. Some had been admitted for true mental illness, but many others had committed no crime at all. A wife who argued with her husband, a son who disobeyed his father, a widow who refused remarriage. The asylum became a dumping ground for society's discomforts. Those who didn't fit were locked away until they no longer existed. Among the files were letters never sent, tucked between pages by desperate hands. Some were written in shaky scrawls, others in eloquent prose, all pleading for freedom. One such letter, written in 1843 by a man named Thomas Bell, still haunts historians. It read, "Ah, Brooke, sir, I am not mad. I am tired. I have told them this, but they keep me here. I can hear them walking at night, the ones they put below. They say the earth breathes beneath the floor. Please, if this letter finds you, tell my wife I still pray. Tell her the stars are still bright above the walls." The letter was never delivered. It was found in 1956, still sealed. Some of the most chilling discoveries weren't written at all. They were physical. Stored with the files were photographs, faded black and white portraits taken by early asylum staff for medical documentation. But the expressions captured were far from scientific. The patients looked terrified, hollow-eyed, broken. Some had been restrained during their photos. Others had faces so blank, so lifeless, that they seemed more ghost than human. Archivists also uncovered lists of unmarked graves behind the asylum grounds. Over 600 names, or in many cases numbers, appeared on a burial ledger. Most were marked cause of death, exhaustion, or natural causes. Yet historians noted that several deaths occurred on the same day, sometimes a dozen or more, often after reports of disciplinary treatment. There were whispers that during harsh winters patients were confined to unheated rooms as endurance exercises. Many froze to death. Their bodies were buried before morning. As researchers dug deeper, they began to realize that the asylum's darkest truth wasn't just in its cruelty, it was in how long it was ignored. Decades of administrations had passed, each one covering the sins of the last. When state inspectors visited, they were shown only the sunny wards, the gardens, the sewing rooms, the quiet patients. The underground cells where the most broken souls were kept remained hidden behind locked iron doors labeled storage. But the most disturbing discovery came from a set of audio recordings made in the 1940s by a journalist investigating rumors of abuse. The reels were never released publicly but survived in the archives. On them, attendants could be heard laughing as patients cried. One man repeated over and over, "Don't lock me in there again. Don't lock me in the dark." A woman's voice, perhaps an attendant, whispered, "They see things in there, you know, things not from this world." The more the files were studied, the clearer it became. This was not just a story about medical failure, it was about dehumanization, about how the forgotten became invisible while the powerful wrote history. The patients of America's first asylum were not lunatics or monsters. They were people erased by misunderstanding and fear, and when the world finally rediscovered them, all that was left were fragments. Letters that never reached home, names carved into wood, sketches on the backs of treatment forms. In 1960, a historian named Dr. Miriam Collins visited the site before it was demolished. She wrote in her journal, "Brother, there are voices here still. You feel them when you stand in the East Wing. They are not angry, only waiting to be remembered." Her words became the foundation of the modern investigation into asylum history. It wasn't just about exposing the past. It was about giving the forgotten back their humanity. The files that lay buried in dust for over a century became testimony, silent witnesses speaking at last. And as the old asylum's bricks were pulled down, workmen found something that froze them in their tracks, a hidden room behind a wall, sealed off since the 1850s. Inside were 12 iron chairs bolted to the floor, still bearing leather restraints. On one wall, written in faint charcoal, were the words, "He, we were never mad. Ibri." No one could say who wrote it, but perhaps it didn't matter. For Abigail, for Thomas, for the thousands who lived and died unseen, their stories, forgotten for generations, are finally being told. not from the official records, but from the dust they left behind. By the mid-19th century, the asylum that had once been founded on compassion had turned into something far darker, not only for the patients but for the very men who claimed to cure them. The doctors who walked those halls, dressed in their polished boots and carrying ledgers of scientific progress, began to lose their own grip on reason. Madness, it seemed, was contagious within those walls. It began subtly. A few of the physicians complained of sleepless nights, hearing footsteps echoing after the patients had been locked away. Others spoke of dreams too vivid to be natural. Yet, they did not leave. The asylum had become an obsession for its medical staff, a living laboratory where they could experiment without consequence. Behind the guise of science, morality eroded piece by piece, and men who had once taken an oath to heal began to believe they could reshape the human mind through force. One of the most infamous among them was Dr. Samuel Gray, who succeeded Dr. Elijah Winthrop in 1829. On the surface, Gray was everything the asylum needed: charismatic, well-spoken, and devoted to the advancement of psychiatric science. He gave speeches on the future of medicine and wrote articles for medical journals describing new therapeutic interventions for hysteria and mania. But his notebooks, discovered decades later, told a much darker story. In his private writings, Dr. Gray described the asylum as a crucible of reason, a place where he could test the boundaries of morality in the name of progress. He believed that mental illness was not a disease, but a rebellion of the soul, something that could be broken through obedience and sensory control. Pain is the truest teacher, he wrote in 1832, and silence is its most devoted pupil. His experiments reflected that twisted philosophy. He introduced a new form of isolation therapy in which patients were locked in soundproof chambers for days, sometimes weeks, with no human contact. He claimed it would purge the mind of external confusion. Many emerged incoherent, shaking, or completely catatonic. Some never emerged at all. But perhaps most horrifying was his use of what he called illumination treatment. Dr. Gray believed light could cure delusion. He installed iron chairs in a white-tiled room, fitted with mirrored walls, and forced patients to sit under bright lamps for hours. Over time, their eyes would bleed, their skin would blister, and their minds, already fragile, would fracture completely. Yet Gray recorded these results as positive responses to stimulation. Other doctors followed his lead. Without oversight, the asylum became a breeding ground for cruelty disguised as research. One physician, Dr. Joseph Mercer, began performing crude brain surgeries, drilling small holes into patients' skulls in hopes of releasing excess emotion. Another, Dr. Lydia Crane, administered near-fatal doses of opium and laudanum, claiming to be experimenting with tranquility. They called their victims subjects, not souls. The line between doctor and patient blurred completely when the madness began to consume the staff. Nurses reported seeing Dr. Gray speaking to empty rooms, calling out to patients who had died years earlier. Late at night, attendants claimed they heard him pacing the wards, muttering scripture under his breath. One journal entry, dated November 1836, simply read, "Abrihi, the walls are listening, the eyes follow. I am no longer sure who is observing whom. Within a year, 2 staff members disappeared without explanation. Their rooms were cleared, their names erased from rosters." When questioned, Dr. Gray said only, they were unfit for the work. Rumors spread that they had been buried behind the East Wing, the same area where the underground cells stood. By the 1840s, the asylum had become a kingdom of fear. Patients trembled at the sight of their physicians. Attendants whispered that the doctors had made a pact, that something unholy watched over the asylum and demanded obedience. Strange symbols were carved into door frames, candles burned at odd hours in the surgical room. The line between medicine and ritual was gone. A local priest, Father Michael Rowan, was called to bless the asylum in 1845 after a series of unexplained deaths. His diary recounts what he found. There was something in the air, a heaviness, a sorrow. The physicians met me with forced smiles, but their eyes were hollow. In the lower hall, I saw stains upon the floor that no one would name. I said prayers in each ward, but the patients only stared, as if they no longer recognized daylight as real. What Father Rowan didn't know was that Dr. Gray had begun experimenting on himself. His journals described doses of experimental chemicals, laudanum mixed with mercury, small shocks of static electricity to balance the mind. He became erratic, paranoid, claiming to see his former mentor, Dr. Winthrop, standing at the foot of his bed at night. By 1848, his handwriting had deteriorated into a near unreadable scrawl. His final entry read, "Apresi, they are not mad, they are awake. It is we who are blind." After his death, the asylum fell into administrative chaos. Several doctors resigned, citing unexplainable phenomena and visions unfit for the sane. The surviving staff sealed Dr. Gray's office, but his notes, and his methods, continued to shape the asylum for decades. What he began in the name of medicine became legend, the story of the doctors who caught the madness they tried to cure. Modern researchers believe the conditions inside the asylum, isolation, exhaustion, exposure to trauma, led to shared psychosis among staff members, a phenomenon now known as folie à plusieurs, or madness of many. But some locals still insist something darker lingered there, something that fed on the suffering, whispering in the ears of doctors until they believed themselves divine. By the time the asylum finally closed its doors in the 1940s, only fragments of its medical staff remained. The rest had either resigned, vanished, or been committed to institutions of their own. When the building was later demolished, construction workers uncovered a wall hidden behind the main infirmary. Etched into the plaster in Dr. Gray's own handwriting were the words, "A brr, we cured none, we only joined them." In the end, the story of the doctors was not one of science or progress, but of power, and how easily power corrodes even the most noble intentions. The asylum was built to contain madness, but it became clear that madness had always been at its heart, not in the patients, but in those who thought they could master the human soul. Hidden beneath the crumbling floors of America's first asylum lay a world that even its most seasoned caretakers refused to speak about, the basement, a place sealed away from prying eyes and absent from all official blueprints. Above, the asylum bustled with the facade of treatment, the clatter of keys, the murmured prayers, and the metallic scrape of stretchers. But below, in the cold silence of the underground, something darker festered. It was where medicine met madness, where the line between human and experiment dissolved completely. The existence of this secret basement was not publicly known until nearly a century later, when demolition crews in the 1940s discovered a series of bricked-up tunnels and rooms far below the main wards. What they found inside stunned the world. Rusted chains embedded into walls, makeshift operating tables streaked with age-darkened stains, jars of preserved organs, and faded notebooks filled with cryptic entries signed only by initials. It was a discovery that confirmed what many had whispered for generations. The asylum had been conducting experiments that went far beyond treatment. Back in the 1830s, this hidden level was not always a secret. Initially, it was built to store medical supplies and provide quarantine space for contagious patients. But as the asylum's leadership shifted toward experimentation under men like Dr. Samuel Gray and later Dr. Joseph Mercer, the basement became a laboratory, a place where the desperate, the forgotten, and the voiceless were turned into subjects of human experimentation. Patients who were too violent, too disobedient, or simply too inconvenient were transferred below. Their files were marked with a red slash, a quiet death sentence hidden in paperwork. They were said to have been moved to special treatment, but none ever returned. Some attendants swore they could hear screams rising through the floorboards during the night, low, muffled cries that grew quieter over the years, as if the basement had swallowed them whole. Dr. Mercer, who succeeded Dr. Gray in 1849, expanded the basement's purpose. He believed that insanity could be surgically removed from the brain, a belief shared by early advocates of lobotomy-like procedures decades before the practice became infamous. Without anesthesia or sterilization, He would drill holes into patients' skulls, claiming to release the demons of delusion. His notes, recovered from a locked trunk found in the basement, detailed each case meticulously. Abra, subject 47, male, age 32. Shows reduction in violent outbursts after procedure, speech lost, motor control impaired. Considered success. Abra, but Mercer's ambitions didn't end with crude surgery. He began to experiment with sensory deprivation, keeping patients chained in darkness for weeks at a time to cleanse the mind of external influence. Some were left in water-filled tubs, their bodies restrained, their eyes covered, the earliest recorded instances of isolation therapy. The result was predictable. Psychosis deepened, and humanity faded from their faces. Yet to Mercer, these hollow-eyed victims were proof of progress. Rumors began spreading among staff. Attendants whispered of patients with shaved heads and stitched wounds, of figures dragging themselves up the basement stairs, whispering prayers in broken voices. Nurses who went missing were said to have been reassigned, yet their names disappeared from the roster completely. The asylum became a machine of silence, every horror buried deeper beneath the ground. One janitor's journal, discovered years later, gives a chilling first-hand account. Abraka down there. The air feels thick, like the walls are breathing. The doctors say it's just damp, but I've seen things. Shadows moving when there's no lamp. I found one of the patients chained to a gurney, eyes wide open, lips stitched shut. Dr. Mercer told me not to speak of it again. I don't think he was treating them, I think he was feeding something. Indeed, Mercer's obsession took on an increasingly supernatural edge. By the 1850s, he had begun referring to the basement as the underworld, a term he claimed represented the threshold between life and madness. He ordered strange symbols carved into the walls and floors, spirals, circles, and inscriptions in Latin and Hebrew. His later writings describe attempts to transfer the essence of consciousness, what modern researchers would call early grotesque forms of soul transference experiments. It's believed that Mercer, perhaps driven by guilt or pure delusion, began to think the asylum itself was alive, a sentient structure feeding on human suffering. He wrote, "Ibrisri the walls whisper when blood is spilled. The air grows warmer when fear rises. It watches. It learns." Those words would later fuel ghost stories that still surround the site today. Paranormal investigators claim that the lower tunnels remain unnaturally cold, and electronic devices malfunction when brought near the foundation. Some believe the doctors, patients, and victims who died there never left, that the walls absorbed their agony. After Mercer's mysterious death in 1857, his body found in the basement, eyes burned and hands clutching a broken mirror, the area was sealed off completely. Administrators ordered new brickwork to hide the stairway, and all documentation regarding the lower levels was destroyed. The official report listed Mercer's cause of death as self-inflicted trauma during mental collapse. But whispers among surviving staff told another story, that he had seen something in the dark that looked back at him. By the early 1900s, the asylum was running under new management, and the basement was little more than a rumor. However, construction workers making repairs during that period claimed to hear knocks from beneath the floor, as if something still moved below. One foreman quit after witnessing a handprint appear on the inside of a sealed wall. His report was dismissed as hysteria. When demolition finally began in the 1940s, everything came full circle. The walls of the basement were uncovered, revealing rooms perfectly preserved, the operating tables, rusted restraints, and sealed jars still in place. But it was what they found in the last chamber that horrified even seasoned investigators, a collection of photographs nailed to the walls, hundreds of them, depicting patients during and after treatments, faces contorted in pain, eyes lifeless, expressions frozen in terror. Among the photos was one image labeled simply Experiment 93. It showed a patient strapped upright, mouth open mid-scream, and standing beside him, blurred but visible, was Dr. Mercer himself, staring straight into the camera, smiling faintly. That discovery confirmed what locals had whispered for a century, that the basement was not a place of healing, but a theater of cruelty. It represented everything that can go wrong when science loses its humanity, when progress becomes an excuse for perversion. Even today, few records remain of what truly occurred in those tunnels. Historians believe the experiments were covered up by state officials, eager to preserve the asylum's reputation. Yet the energy of the place endures in legend. Tales of voices echoing from beneath the earth, of old medical instruments appearing in the soil after storms, of a faint knocking that still echoes from where the basement once stood. To this day, no one knows how many died down there. The walls were never exhumed, the tunnels never fully explored. The site was later turned into a park, and beneath the grass lies the rotting skeleton of that forgotten underworld, where science met horror and humanity was buried alive. Long after the asylum's gates were shut, its corridors remained alive with echoes, whispers that refused to die, footsteps that came from nowhere, and faint sobs that rose like fog in the night. These were said to be the forgotten patients, the nameless, faceless souls who vanished into the institution's labyrinth of wards, never to be seen again. To the doctors and clerks of the era, they were numbers, file entries, case studies. But to the walls, they were something else entirely, voices etched into the stone, refusing to be erased. When the asylum first opened in the early 1800s, there were promises of compassion, structure, and healing. The founders claimed it would be a sanctuary for the disordered mind, but in truth, it became a warehouse for the unwanted. Those labeled insane in those days could include anyone from a grieving mother to a rebellious wife, an orphan, or even a veteran suffering from trauma. The asylum's population grew beyond capacity, and soon the human soul became a commodity measured in rations and space. Overcrowding turned the asylum into a furnace of suffering. Patients slept in hallways, chained to bedposts, or locked together in iron-barred dormitories. The attendants, often untrained and brutal, treated them like livestock. Reports from early inspectors mention filthy bedding, open wounds, and a stench that no cleansing can undo. But worse than the physical misery was the silence, the deliberate erasure of identity. When a patient died, their name was crossed out in ledgers, their belongings discarded, and their body buried in an unmarked pit behind the building. No prayers, no farewells, just soil, darkness, and anonymity. Some historians estimate that more than 4,000 individuals passed through the asylum's doors over its century of operation, yet fewer than 800 were ever officially recorded as discharged or deceased. The rest simply vanished. Researchers who later examined surviving records found a disturbing pattern: pages torn from ledgers, altered death certificates, and entire patient logs missing for certain years, particularly during the tenure of Dr. Joseph Mercer, the same director who turned the basement into his secret laboratory. Whispers among staff suggested that some of these disappearances were not deaths at all, but experiments gone wrong, patients silenced after procedures that left them disfigured or deranged beyond recognition. Those who survived were hidden in remote cells, referred to only by numbers. A recovered medical note read chillingly, "Bar subject 108 shows no memory, speech, or voluntary movement. Retains heartbeat and ocular reaction. Keep restrained." But there were also accounts, both contemporary and modern, of something far stranger. Workers and attendants claimed to hear voices late at night, calling out from rooms that had been sealed for decades. Some even reported hearing names, not screams, but quiet, pleading tones repeating over and over, as though begging to be remembered. During the 1920s, a nurse named Eleanor Ray documented her experiences in a diary that was found long after her death. Her entries describe events that defy explanation. Brr, I was cleaning Ward D when I heard a woman humming. It was an old lullaby, the kind my mother sang to me. The sound came from behind the sealed door. I unlocked it, but there was nothing inside, only a bed frame and dust. Yet I swear the air was warm, like someone had just left. Eleanor's diary continues with increasingly distressed entries, notes of seeing handprints appear on fogged windows, of patients whispering in languages they never spoke before, and of hearing her own name called when no one was there. In one passage, she writes, "Abruka, it's not madness that haunts this place, it's memory. The walls remember more than we ever will, Modern paranormal investigators who have studied the site claim that such accounts might be connected to residual energy phenomena, a theory suggesting that intense emotional trauma can imprint on physical surroundings. If that's true, then the asylum's decaying structure might be one vast recording of human pain, endlessly replaying. But there are darker interpretations. Some believe that the voices are not echoes, but remnants, conscious fragments of the patients themselves, trapped between death and memory. When the asylum's basement was unearthed in the 1940s, workers reported hearing faint murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. A foreman later testified, "Abe Burke, it wasn't the wind. It was like 100 people whispering just under the floor, talking over one another, too low to understand. When we broke one of the walls open, the sound stopped, instantly." To this day, researchers continue to uncover small artifacts tied to those lost patients. Scraps of uniforms, hairpins, children's toys, and crudely carved wooden figures found buried beneath the soil. Each discovery seems to add another thread to the asylum's tapestry of grief. In one excavation, archaeologists uncovered a mass burial site containing the remains of dozens of individuals, many of them bound at the wrists. Some skulls bore evidence of crude trepanation, holes drilled into the bone, a clear sign of experimental procedures. One body found near the foundation was especially haunting, a small child, no more than 8 years old, still clutching a porcelain doll with half its face missing. The doll's eye sockets had been filled with tiny glass marbles, one blue, one black. It remains one of the most disturbing finds in the site's history. Psychics and spiritual mediums who have visited the ruins describe an overwhelming sense of drowning, choking, and confusion, as if dozens of consciousnesses are still trapped, fighting to speak. Some even report the sensation of being watched, followed by sudden nausea or coldness. Instruments malfunction in the basement areas, and sound recordings often capture faint whispers or humming, the same lullaby that Eleanor once described. Perhaps the most chilling story comes from a police officer who investigated the area in the 1970s. He claimed to have found a narrow cell with scratch marks covering every surface, spelling the same phrase again and again, "Abru, let us out." Experts argue over whether these phenomena are supernatural or psychological, but one fact is beyond dispute. Thousands entered the asylum and never returned. Their names lost, their stories buried, they became the foundation of the building itself, their agony absorbed by the walls. Today, the asylum's ruins stand silent. The state fenced off the property decades ago, but trespassers still report hearing weeping in the halls, the sound of chains dragging across the floor, and doors that close by themselves. Some say they see faces in the windows at night, pale, watching, waiting. It's as if the asylum is still alive, its forgotten patients still reaching out through time, desperate to be acknowledged. Their stories may never be fully known, but their presence lingers, whispering a truth that history tried to bury. Aubrey, not all who were forgotten were gone. Dr. Joseph Mercer arrived at the asylum in 1847 with a vision, a young, ambitious physician from Virginia who believed the mind could be cured through science. He came with modern theories, a silver tongue, and an unsettling calmness that made others listen when he spoke. The board of directors saw in him the promise of reform, someone who could drag the asylum out of its barbaric reputation and into the age of enlightenment. But what began as innovation soon twisted into obsession. And by the time anyone realized it, Dr. Mercer's work had already crossed a line that no sane man should ever cross. In the early years of his tenure, Mercer transformed the asylum's practices. He banned routine beatings, ordered the removal of chains from patient rooms, and insisted that mental illness should be treated, not punished. His reforms earned him national recognition. Newspapers praised his humane revolution, and his lectures drew crowds of physicians and clergy alike. But behind closed doors, Mercer was experimenting. His obsession wasn't with compassion, it was with control. He wanted to command the human mind the way one commands a machine. His fascination grew after he studied early cases of what he called psychic repetition, patients who reenacted the same trauma endlessly, as though their minds were broken loops. To Mercer, this wasn't madness. It was a code, a pattern to be deciphered. He began conducting experiments to reset the brain by removing what he described as traumatic memory nodes. At first, his subjects were volunteers from among the patients, those desperate for release, but as his obsession deepened, the experiments became crueler. By 1852, Mercer had established a secret ward in the asylum's lower basement, accessible only by a steel door he alone possessed the key to. Officially, it was listed as a contagion ward, closed to the public due to supposed outbreaks of fever. In reality, it became his personal laboratory of horrors. Witnesses later claimed that strange lights and metallic noises echoed from below the asylum after dark. Nurses whispered of screams that stopped abruptly, replaced by eerie silence. Mercer's notes, discovered decades later, reveal the disturbing logic behind his work. He believed that by isolating pain within the brain, one could purge madness entirely, leaving behind a calm, obedient being. But his methods were crude: trepanation, chemical injections, and electrical stimulation far beyond what the body could bear. In his journals, he wrote of momentary clarity achieved through agony, brief windows when patients became calm, silent, and empty of will. "They no longer scream," Mercer wrote in 1853. "They only breathe, as if newly born, not into life, but into obedience." When funding began to dry up, Mercer forged records and falsified success reports. He wrote to medical journals about breakthroughs that didn't exist, even claiming he had revived a patient's consciousness after death. This claim, dismissed as delusion by most, marked the beginning of his decline. He started locking himself inside the asylum for days, refusing food and sleep. Staff noticed his growing paranoia. He accused them of betrayal, claiming that the patients are listening through the walls. Then came the night of August 19, 1855, the night the asylum changed forever. According to the surviving report, a fire broke out in the lower levels of the building. Several staff members were injured trying to extinguish it, but the flames seemed localized, burning only the basement. When the doors were finally forced open, they found Mercer inside, half conscious, his face blackened with soot, surrounded by 7 corpses. The bodies were mutilated, their skulls open, wires running from one head to another like a grotesque network. Some of the corpses were still warm, others long dead. Mercer was found kneeling before his creation, muttering over and over, "Ibrika, they speak as one now. They are free." The board had no choice but to declare him insane. He was removed from his position and quietly confined to one of the very rooms he had once supervised. But even locked away, Mercer continued his work. Guards claimed he scribbled endlessly on the walls with coal, drawing diagrams of the human skull and writing strange formulas. One guard testified that Mercer would whisper to himself all night, as though answering unseen voices. Others swore that lights flickered in his cell when no candles were lit. A few weeks before his death, Mercer wrote a final note that still chills historians. "Brr, the experiment is not over. The mind cannot be destroyed, only transferred. They will find me when the wires hum again." He died in 1857, officially of a seizure. But when the guards entered his room, they found something unexplainable. His body was cold, but his eyes were open. Witnesses swore they saw faint movement, a flutter in his pupils, as if he were still watching. The body was buried in the asylum cemetery without ceremony, the grave unmarked. Yet rumors spread that strange phenomena began occurring soon after. Electrical surges would flicker through the asylum during thunderstorms, accompanied by the faint sound of whispers echoing through the vents. Tools went missing, lights dimmed unexpectedly, and several attendants claimed to see a shadowy figure in the basement corridors, tall, thin, wearing a doctor's coat, carrying what looked like a lantern of light. One nurse, terrified, resigned after claiming she saw Dr. Mercer standing by the morgue table, his hands moving though he had no flesh left to move them. In the 1930s, when the asylum was finally abandoned, a team of archaeologists and historians excavating the site found the remnants of Mercer's laboratory. They unearthed rusted equipment, skull fragments drilled in identical places, and jars containing preserved human tissue. But what disturbed them most was a steel box hidden behind a wall. Inside it were Mercer's last recorded notes, along with something even stranger, a human brain preserved in fluid, wired to 2 copper rods. Attached was a label written in his unmistakable handwriting, subject M, conscious. Tests revealed the specimen was over 80 years old, but traces of faint electrical activity were still detected, something scientists couldn't fully explain. The artifact was quietly transferred to a state archive, where it remains locked away under restricted access. To this day, legends persist that Mercer's spirit haunts the site of the old asylum. Locals call him the Whispering Doctor, a phantom said to appear near electrical storms, his presence marked by flickering lights and the smell of burned metal. Paranormal investigators who have visited the ruins claim to capture audio recordings of faint murmurs, repeating phrases like, "not dead yet" or "still working." Dr. Joseph Mercer began his life as a healer, a man of intellect and progress, but by the end, he became a prisoner of his own ambition, a man who looked too deeply into the abyss of the human mind and found something staring back. His story is a grim reminder that the thin line between genius and madness is often drawn in blood, and sometimes, in the dark silence of an asylum basement, that line disappears altogether. By the late 1850s, after Dr. Mercer's disgrace and mysterious death, the asylum's reputation was collapsing. What had once been hailed as a beacon of progress in mental health was now regarded as a house of madness itself. Families stopped sending patients. State inspectors stopped visiting. And yet, behind those decaying stone walls, life, or something like it, continued. The asylum's new administrators understood one thing: Mercer's legacy had to be erased. But some stains can't be washed away. They must be burned. It began with the East Wing, a vast echoing labyrinth of wards that had been sealed since the Mercer fire. The new director, Dr. Edwin Latham, declared the wing unsanitary and irreparable. He claimed it harbored mold, vermin, and disease, but those who had worked under Mercer knew better. The East Wing was where his most horrifying experiments had taken place, where dozens, maybe hundreds of patients vanished under the guise of medical progress. Latham's plan wasn't about sanitation, it was about silence. In 1862, under the cover of night, the East Wing was ordered cleared. All remaining records were gathered. Files, journals, surgical notes, even patients' personal belongings, and carried into the lower halls. Witnesses later described the eerie calm of that evening. No one spoke as the attendants moved in a slow procession, like mourners at a funeral. Some said they heard whispers coming from the stacks of boxes, as if the artifacts themselves protested their erasure. Then came the flames. The official report states that a controlled fire was set to cleanse the area. But what followed was anything but controlled. Once the torches touched the walls, the blaze erupted with unnatural ferocity. Witnesses claimed the fire moved against the wind, spreading too fast, too bright, as though the building itself wanted to be consumed. Within minutes, the East Wing was an inferno. The fire's glow could be seen from miles away, lighting the night sky like a second sun. Inside, screams were heard, not of patients, but of voices that shouldn't have been there. Attendants who survived swore they heard multiple people crying out for help, though the wing had been emptied hours before. Some claimed they saw shapes, translucent forms writhing in the smoke as if the souls of Mercer's victims were being pulled from the walls themselves. By dawn, the East Wing was gone, reduced to blackened rubble and melted iron. But the fire didn't just take the structure, it took history. Over a century's worth of medical records were turned to ash. When the embers cooled, investigators found remains, not just of brick and steel, but of bones. A worker who was part of the cleanup later confessed, "We found skulls, too many." Some still had nails driven through them, like someone had tried to stop them from speaking. The discovery was buried in bureaucracy. Officials blamed it on previous burials disrupted by the heat, yet whispers persisted that the East Wing had become a tomb long before the fire. In the weeks following the blaze, the asylum changed. Something unseen hung in the air, a heaviness that pressed on the chest, The few remaining patients grew restless, claiming to see figures walking in the halls at night, their skin charred, their mouths open in silent screams. Nurses reported hearing footsteps pacing the East Wing ruins long after the area was sealed. One wrote in her log, "Ibrahim, there is no one there, and yet someone walks." Always between midnight and 2, the survivors of that night rarely spoke again. Dr. Latham himself was never the same. Once calm and composed, he began to unravel. He stopped holding meetings, refused to sleep, and insisted that the fire hadn't destroyed Mercer's work. It had only released it. His final recorded statement, written in a trembling hand, read, "Ibrahim, the walls still whisper. The fire fed them, not silenced them. They live in the smoke now. Ibru." In the following year, staff began disappearing. At first, 1 or 2 at a time. A janitor, a nurse, an orderly. Their personal effects remained, but they were never found. Then patients began vanishing as well, even from locked rooms. Each time someone went missing, a faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. Some said they saw black handprints appearing on the walls, prints that could not be washed away. By the 1870s, the asylum's East Wing was left in ruins, sealed off by heavy iron gates. Ivy and moss grew over the charred stones, but locals claimed they could still see embers glowing faintly at night, as if the fire was still burning beneath the earth. The few brave enough to venture near swore they heard crackling and soft weeping, like the building itself was alive. When paranormal investigators visited the site in the 1930s, they uncovered fragments of melted equipment and scorched journals fused into the floor. One legible note contained Mercer's handwriting, although he had been dead for decades. It read, "Ibrahim, the experiment continues. The mind survives the flesh. Fire cannot erase it." The investigators left after one of their team members collapsed, claiming he saw a man made of ash standing in the corner of the ruins. His eyes, he said, glowed red like coals. Later studies suggested that the fire may have burned hotter than any natural source should have allowed, temperatures consistent with industrial furnaces, not simple wooden structures. Scientists remain puzzled by how such heat could have been generated without modern fuel. Some suggest the fire might have been accelerated by chemicals Mercer once stored there, though. No evidence of them was ever found. The East Wing became a forbidden subject among locals. Even after the asylum closed permanently, townspeople avoided the ruins. Children dared each other to touch the gates, but none lingered. Some claimed that if you listened closely at night, you could hear faint crackling, followed by whispers calling your name, soft, pleading, like someone asking to be let out. When the asylum grounds were finally sold for redevelopment in the 1950s, construction halted after several workers reported accidents and strange phenomena. Equipment failed, fires started without cause, and one worker fell to his death after claiming he saw faces in the smoke. The project was abandoned, and the area was declared unsafe. Today, nothing remains of the East Wing except the outline of its foundation, hidden beneath weeds and stone. Yet those who visit claim the ground still feels warm, unnaturally so, even in winter. Paranormal recordings often pick up the sound of faint breathing, or what experts call EVPs, ghostly audio impressions. When enhanced, one phrase repeats again and again, low and broken, "Ibrahim still burning, still here." Whether it was an attempt to cleanse evil or conceal it, the burning of the East Wing became the asylum's defining tragedy, a desperate act to destroy the evidence of humanity's darkest curiosity. But in trying to erase the past, they unleashed something that never truly died. The East Wing stands as a haunting reminder that you can burn a building but not its memories, and that sometimes fire doesn't purify. It feeds the darkness instead. Time is supposed to bury the past, to soften the horror and erase the echoes of cruelty. But the asylum that once loomed in North Carolina refuses to stay silent, even after more than a century of abandonment, after the fires, the demolitions, the bulldozers, and the lies. The ground itself still seems to breathe. The forgotten asylum, America's first and darkest, may have been stripped from official records, but it lingers like a curse on the land and in the minds of all who dare to remember. The 20th century brought progress, science, and psychiatry's new dawn. But every generation that tried to reclaim the asylum grounds faced something that defied both logic and faith. In 1923, when the state proposed converting the ruins into a sanatorium for war veterans, construction workers found the foundations unevenly warm, even in freezing weather. Geologists could not explain it. The site's temperature remained 10 degrees higher than the surrounding land. Work was halted after several men claimed they saw smoke rising from the earth, thin, gray tendrils that smelled faintly of burnt hair. A year later, 2 engineers entered the site at night to take readings. They never returned. Their bodies were discovered days later at the edge of the property, eyes wide open and skin cold as ash, though there were no signs of injury. The coroner listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest brought on by shock, but witnesses swore both men were found covered in soot, as if dragged through a chimney. Throughout the 1930s, locals reported strange lights moving along the tree line and low moaning sounds during storms. Farmers near the area refused to till the soil closest to the asylum's ruins. They said their oxen refused to go near it, pulling away in terror, sometimes breaking harnesses to flee. One farmer wrote in his diary in 1938, "I hear the ground hums here. When I put my ear down, I hear crying. It's faint, like under the floorboards." Then, in 1941, the U.S. government attempted to purchase the property for a mental research facility. Blueprints were drawn, funding approved, but the project never began. Within months, every member of the planning committee resigned, citing unforeseen disturbances. One of them, a psychiatrist, named Dr. Howard Blakely, later confessed to a local reporter, "Abrithie, the land doesn't want us there. I don't know how else to say it. It's like something remembers." After that, the property became a forbidden zone. Teenagers from nearby towns turned it into a dare, sneaking onto the grounds to prove their courage. Some returned laughing, claiming to hear footsteps or whispers. Others didn't return at all. From 1951 to 1972, 7 disappearances were recorded near the old asylum site. Local authorities dismissed them as accidents or runaways. But the families never stopped looking, and all search dogs brought to the area refused to go past the rusted gates, whining and backing away with tails between their legs. In the 1980s, a team of paranormal researchers from Duke University decided to test the legends. They brought with them electromagnetic sensors, recording devices, and night vision cameras. What they found was something science couldn't explain. Their footage, though now largely lost, allegedly captured shadow figures moving across the burned foundation. One researcher, Dr. Elaine Monroe, described what she saw in her final journal entry, at exactly 3:17 a.m. The air shifted, static filled the audio, the ground began to vibrate. Then I saw them, people, dozens of them, walking through smoke that wasn't there. Their faces were blurred, but I could see their mouths moving, whispering. Some had no eyes. And then I realized they were all wearing hospital gowns. The next morning, Dr. Monroe quit the project and refused to speak publicly again. Her colleagues reported strange illnesses in the following weeks: rashes that wouldn't heal, vivid nightmares, and the constant scent of burning wood. One member, a sound engineer named Robert Avery, died in his sleep 2 weeks later. His wife claimed his last words were, "They're still screaming." For decades, the asylum remained untouched, an open wound on the land, growing over with vines but never truly healed. Urban explorers in the early 2000s reignited interest, sneaking into the site with handheld cameras and flashlights. One viral video from 2009, uploaded to YouTube under the title Voices of the Forgotten Asylum, showed a group entering what they thought was the old surgical ward. They joked, laughed, until one of them began to scream. The footage shook the internet. The young man's camera captured handprints appearing on the walls, glowing faintly in the dark, like heat signatures forming from nothing. Moments later, the camera dropped to the ground. His friends called his name, panicked, before the video cut to static. The uploader later claimed his friend had simply run off, but the man was never seen again. Police investigated but found nothing but melted footprints leading to the edge of the ruins. The asylum's story began circulating once more. Blogs, documentaries, conspiracy channels, everyone had a theory that it was cursed, that it sat atop ancient burial grounds, that Mercer's experiments had somehow opened a doorway between worlds. Yet, one fact remained constant. The energy there was alive, changing, reacting to those who disturbed it. In 2015, construction crews tried again to develop the land into a private housing complex. But during the excavation, they unearthed something no one expected. Hundreds of glass jars, each containing fragments of bone and teeth, preserved in cloudy liquid. Experts identified the materials as human, likely dating back to the 1840s. Several jars were labeled with numbers and initials, consistent with Mercer's patient records. But when catalogued, the jars inexplicably shattered overnight in the laboratory, leaving behind a black, tar-like residue that smelled of sulfur and decay. After that, all redevelopment plans were abandoned. The state fenced off the land once more, citing toxic contamination. But locals knew the truth. You can't build over evil, not when it breathes, not when it remembers. Today, visitors still report strange phenomena. Phones die without reason, cameras malfunction, recordings capture whispers saying, "Help me," or "He's still here." Some claim to see the faint outline of a building, flickering in and out of reality when fog rolls over the field. And always there is that smell, faint smoke, lingering in the air like the last breath of the past. Historians who have tried to piece together the asylum's full history describe it as a perfect storm of cruelty and curiosity, a place where science lost its soul. Yet, as more evidence surfaces, lost records, personal diaries, charred surgical tools, it becomes clear that the building may not be the only thing haunted. The land itself has memory, a kind of sentience, holding on to every scream, every betrayal, every act of inhumanity committed there. One modern paranormal investigator summarized it best: "Hebrsee, the asylum isn't haunted because of what happened there. It's haunted because it refuses to forget." Hebrui. Some say that's why birds never land on the property. Others say if you walk there alone at night and whisper your name, you'll hear another voice whisper it back, from beneath your feet. In the end, America's first asylum stands as a mirror of human cruelty, a warning about the cost of progress built on pain. Time has tried to bury it, but the earth itself seems unwilling to let go. Maybe that's what makes this place truly terrifying. Not the ghosts of the dead, but the proof that some places, once poisoned by human hands, never stop bleeding. For over 2 centuries, the asylum that once stood in the outskirts of Pennsylvania had remained a ghost, not in the form of spirits that haunted its crumbling halls, but in the silence that blanketed its past. The institution's name had been erased from modern maps, its foundations overgrown by trees, and its stories buried beneath dirt, dust, and deliberate denial. Then came the year 2019, when a small team of archivists, historians, and forensic anthropologists stumbled upon something extraordinary: a hidden archive sealed behind a false wall in the basement of what was once the asylum's administrative wing. What they found inside would change everything historians believed about early American psychiatry, exposing truths so disturbing that even the most stoic researchers struggled to continue reading. Inside that sealed chamber were metal filing drawers, still intact, each marked with a patient's number and faintly handwritten name. The smell of decay, old paper, and mildew filled the air as the team pried them open one by one. What emerged wasn't just history, it was horror documented in ink. Files contained yellowed pages of patient intake forms, doctor's notes, hand-drawn sketches, and, most chillingly, photographs. Each record told a story of someone who had once breathed, screamed, begged, and finally disappeared behind the walls of the asylum, erased from family records and public consciousness alike. Many of these patients had not been insane at all. Their supposed mental illnesses were sometimes no more than grief, stubbornness, trauma, or rebellion. A woman admitted in 1838 had been institutionalized for melancholy after husband's death. A man was labeled schizophrenic after hearing the voice of God while working in fields. One entry described a 15-year-old girl committed for talking back to her father. These people had become victims of a society that sought to silence, not heal. And the asylum, with its locked cells and experimental doctors, became the perfect vessel for that silence. As researchers sorted through the files, they began to notice patterns. Many documents bore the same physician's initials, DMH, later identified as Dr. Daniel M. Hargrove, the asylum superintendent from 1829 to 1851. His notes were methodical but cruelly detached, describing electroshock procedures, sensory deprivation, and humane lobotomies performed on unwilling patients. Margins contained cryptic phrases like subject resistant to treatment, removed to cellar ward, or final observation recorded before disposal. It soon became apparent that these weren't medical treatments at all. They were systematic acts of psychological and physical torture, committed under the guise of progress. What shocked investigators even more were the photographs, daguerreotypes and early tintypes showing patients in various states of distress. Some were strapped to chairs, others posed unnaturally as if for anatomical study. One image, labeled Patient 41, depicted a woman staring directly into the camera with sunken eyes and bruises across her temples, her hands bound in linen wraps. Another photograph showed what seemed to be a young boy, perhaps 12 or 13, sitting in a padded cell, the faint outline of words scratched into the wall behind him. They said I was mad. Alongside these records, researchers uncovered letters never sent, written by patients in trembling handwriting. One letter from 1847 read, "Please tell my mother I am alive. They say I cannot leave until I am better, but I am not sick, only forgotten." These notes became the emotional heart of the discovery, proof that the asylum's so-called patients were lucid enough to understand their imprisonment. When these findings reached the public, the world was horrified. Documentaries were made, exhibitions planned, and historians debated over the ethics of displaying such personal suffering. Some argued that the truth had to be shown to ensure such atrocities were never repeated. Others believed the files should remain sealed out of respect for the dead. But as the debates continued, one thing became clear: this was no ordinary archaeological find. It was a confession from history itself. Further investigation revealed that the asylum's closure in the late 1800s had not been due to reform, as previously believed, but rather to scandal. Reports hinted that bodies of patients were secretly buried in unmarked graves behind the property. Forensic teams began excavation, uncovering shallow burial sites, some containing remains of up to 3 people in a single pit. Many skeletons bore evidence of crude surgical incisions, broken bones, and malnutrition. Nearby, fragments of rusted shackles and restraints were found, confirming the darker side of early psychiatric treatment. What made the discovery even more haunting was that some files had been tampered with. Entire sections were missing, others rewritten in different handwriting. Historians speculated that a later administrator had attempted to hide the truth or destroy incriminating evidence. Yet, ironically, that very attempt preserved the records longer, sealing them away where time, rather than human hands, kept them safe. Among the most significant findings was a ledger listing over 400 names, each followed by a small cross, a mark believed to signify death within the institution. Of these names, fewer than 50 were ever officially recorded as deceased. The rest had simply vanished from history. This revelation triggered a nationwide investigation into similar institutions, and soon, other forgotten asylums across the United States began revealing their own buried horrors. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came when one historian, while cross-referencing the names, realized that several patients' descendants were still alive, unaware of their families' connection to the asylum. Some of these families, when contacted, reacted with disbelief. Others broke down, finally understanding the strange gaps in their family trees. One elderly woman, a great-great-granddaughter of a patient labeled ML, said through tears, "We thought she ran away. All this time she was a prisoner." By the time the investigation concluded, the recovered files had rewritten the early history of American mental health care. They revealed that the nation's first asylum, long celebrated for its progressive approach, was, in truth, an institution of cruelty, control, and silence. The files became a mirror reflecting the fears and ignorance of an era, showing how easily compassion could be twisted into oppression when unchecked by morality. Today, those recovered files rest in a climate-controlled vault, awaiting digitization. The area where the asylum once stood is now a memorial garden, marked with a single plaque that reads, "Bro, here lay those whom society chose to forget. May their silence speak forever." It serves as both a tribute and a warning, proof that sometimes the most terrifying ghosts are not the ones that haunt buildings, but the ones that haunt our collective conscience. When the files from America's first asylum were unearthed, it wasn't just a moment of historical revelation, it was a confrontation with conscience. The discovery forced America to look into a mirror that reflected its darkest and most ignored truth, that cruelty, when cloaked in the language of science and morality, becomes invisible for centuries. The world had always imagined early asylums as places of healing, grim perhaps, but necessary. What the recovered documents revealed, however, was that the asylum system had been built on the foundation of exploitation, classism, racism, and ignorance disguised as care. The immediate impact of the discovery in 2019 rippled through academic and medical institutions alike. Universities began hosting symposiums on the ethics of early psychiatry, questioning how much of modern mental health care was influenced by the flawed principles of the 19th century. A generation of historians, anthropologists, and psychologists suddenly found themselves faced with a moral dilemma: how to reconcile progress built on the bones of the silenced. The unearthed files didn't just expose the horrors of one asylum, they suggested that this was not an isolated case. If the oldest American asylum had operated like this, what did that mean for the dozens that followed? The revelation triggered a chain reaction across the country. Other old asylums, abandoned, converted, or demolished, were revisited by researchers. In several states, including Virginia, Massachusetts, and Ohio, hidden archives began to surface. Each discovery carried the same haunting signature: falsified patient records, secret burials, and cold, bureaucratic cruelty. It was as if America's past had been waiting to speak all along, waiting for someone to finally dig deep enough to listen. But the impact was not limited to historians and scientists. For many descendants of the patients, this discovery reopened emotional wounds that had never healed because they had never been known. Families began requesting DNA tests to identify remains found on asylum grounds. The process was painful, yet deeply human, connecting modern lives with long-erased ancestors who had been locked away simply for being different. News networks aired special documentaries where families shared letters recovered from the archives, messages of hope, faith, and terror written by people who had been forgotten by the very nation that promised liberty. One woman, a teacher from North Carolina, learned that her great-great-grandfather had been admitted to the asylum for fits of melancholy after returning from war. In an interview, she said, "He wasn't mad. He had trauma. We call it PTSD now. They called it insanity." Her words became symbolic of the entire rediscovery, a reminder that so many of those confined were victims of misunderstanding, not illness. In the years that followed, pressure mounted for the U.S. government to acknowledge and address these buried atrocities. Historians and activists pushed for a national memorial for the forgotten patients of America's asylums. After long debate, Congress passed a resolution recognizing the victims of early psychiatric institutions and funding initiatives to preserve and digitize the recovered archives. In 2022, a public ceremony was held at the site of the first asylum's ruins, attended by scholars, families, and mental health advocates. The memorial plaque was unveiled with the inscription, "Ayabrui," in memory of those silenced by ignorance. May their suffering guide our compassion. Beyond remembrance, the discovery also reshaped the field of modern psychiatry. Medical ethics boards began re-evaluating how patient rights were defined and protected. Mental health training programs incorporated modules titled "The Moral Lessons of Early Psychiatry," teaching students that treatment without empathy becomes abuse, and that silence, even in the name of science, is complicity. The recovered journals of doctors like Dr. Hargrove became required reading, not to honor their work, but to recognize the dangers of unchecked authority. Filmmakers, artists, and writers drew inspiration from the asylum's story, transforming history into art that demanded accountability. Independent documentaries titled Whispers from the Ward and the Asylum Files gained international attention, humanizing those long-lost patients. But even amid public fascination, scholars urged restraint, not to sensationalize the dead, but to let their voices be heard through truth, not spectacle. Perhaps the most profound outcome of all was how the discovery reframed the meaning of insanity itself. What was once a diagnosis had for centuries been a social weapon, used against women who spoke too loudly, men who mourned too deeply, children who disobeyed too freely. The asylum's recovered files served as proof that madness was often defined by whoever held the power to declare it. The lesson resonated across generations. The line between sanity and insanity, between treatment and torture, is often drawn by fear, not fact. As the dust settled on the investigations, one final mystery remained. Among the recovered files, there was an unsigned note written in a trembling hand, found tucked inside an empty drawer. It read, "Hibruri, if someone finds this, please tell them we were not lost. We were waiting to be remembered." No one knows who wrote it or when. Some believe it was left by a patient during the asylum's final days. Others suspect it was the work of a sympathetic nurse who could no longer bear to watch. Regardless of its author, the message became the unofficial motto of the Restoration Project. In 2023, a digital database named the Remembered Asylum Project went live. It allowed descendants and historians to access scanned files, letters, and photographs, reconnecting forgotten lives to the world that had erased them. Each document uploaded was treated with reverence, each photograph labeled with a name whenever possible. The project became not just an act of historical preservation, but one of healing. Today, the site of America's first asylum stands quiet, no longer a place of confinement, but of reflection. The air smells of wild grass instead of disinfectant, and the only sounds are wind and birds, where once there were screams and silence. Visitors walk through paths marked with plaques engraved with patient names, those recovered and those still unknown. Flowers grow over the ground that once hid graves, and every spring, volunteers plant white lilies to symbolize remembrance. The asylum's rediscovery was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a reckoning. It reminded the world that progress without humanity is corruption, and that forgetting the past is the surest way to repeat it. It taught that silence, no matter how long it lasts, will one day be broken, because truth, buried as deep as it may be, always finds its way to the surface. And in that truth lies the quiet redemption of those who suffered there, not as ghosts trapped in crumbling walls, but as voices finally heard.